This week, we're going to shift our attention away from plot and character psychology and towards something that usually sits in the background of stories, even though it quietly determines almost everything that can happen inside them. That concept is story world. You can think of story world as the total environment in which a narrative takes place. The spatial layout, the temporal logic, the rules of causality, the social norms, the available technologies, the objects that exist, and the kinds of actions that make sense within that world. Rather than being just a setting or backdrop, story world is an organizing system that shapes meaning before any particular event unfolds. Across the lectures and readings this week, you'll see how story world has historically been under-theorized compared to time, character, and action, even though all narratives necessarily happen somewhere. We'll explore how bringing the background into the foreground allows us to understand stories as structured environments rather than just sequences of events. You'll encounter ideas like affordances, what a world allows characters to do, along with the way spaces, objects, thresholds, and boundaries quietly constrain behavior and create tension. A simple object or location can carry layers of meaning when it's embedded in a richly developed world, especially as stories accumulate history and internal logic over time. We'll also look closely at the relationship between story worlds and characters, and why the two can't really be separated. Certain kinds of characters make sense only in certain kinds of worlds, and worlds themselves imply populations of characters that feel believable within them. You'll see how different aesthetic modes, from ultra-minimalist to highly cinematic, fundamentally change what kinds of characters, emotions, and actions feel plausible. This is especially important in contemporary media, where immersive technologies and virtual production have made world-building a central creative concern rather than a secondary one. Another major idea you'll encounter is the way story worlds organize experience through time and space together. Drawing on literary theory, particularly the concept of the chronotope, the materials show how genres feel different not because of their plots alone, but because they operate according to different time-space logics. A road narrative produces movement and encounter, a single-room drama produces surveillance and pressure, and a confined location can intensify psychological tension just as effectively as overt action. You'll also see how audiences construct mental maps of story worlds, filling in implied spaces that are never directly shown, and how narratives often operate through nested worlds, rooms within buildings, buildings within cities, and physical spaces intertwined with characters' inner psychological worlds. The case study included this week gives you a concrete example of how a story world can do much of the narrative work on its own. By transforming a seemingly pleasant environment into a psychological trap, the film demonstrates how limiting space and recontextualizing a location can generate sustained tension without relying on constant dramatic events. It's a powerful illustration of how atmosphere, spatial restriction, and repetition can shape meaning over time. The assigned reading this week zooms out from individual stories and asks a bigger question about creativity itself. Where does it actually come from? Rather than treating creativity as something that lives entirely inside individual minds, the reading argues that creativity is better understood as a distributed process that unfolds across people, tools, materials, technologies, and cultural systems. Ideas don't simply appear fully formed in isolation. They emerge through interaction, iteration, chance, and selection over time. This perspective helps break down the idea that humans are the only meaningful creative agents, and instead invites us to think about creativity as something that happens within networks that include objects, environments, social evaluation, and increasingly, machines. For our purposes, this is especially important because it provides a strong conceptual foundation for understanding AI not as a replacement for human creativity, but as one component in a larger creative system. One that can generate variation, introduce novelty, and reshape the space of possibilities that artists work within. Seen this way, AI becomes part of the story world of creativity itself, influencing what kinds of ideas are likely to emerge, circulate, and gain value over time. As you move through the materials, keep in mind how directly all of this connects to AI-assisted creative practice. Generative systems respond extremely well to clearly defined worlds, constraints, and internal logic. When you learn to describe not just what happens, but how a world works, what kinds of spaces exist, what objects matter, what actions are possible, You gain far more control over the outputs you get, whether you're generating text or images. This week is about learning to think like a world builder. As you go through the lectures and readings, don't worry about memorizing terminology. Focus instead on how these ideas change the way you imagine, describe, and design worlds. The Prompt Lab this week will give you a chance to put these concepts into practice right away.